The ballroom gleamed with the opulence characteristic of English aristocracy. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light on silk, gowns, and gold-embroidered waistcoats. The Duke of Ravenshire, known for his calculated indifference, leaned against the balcony railing with apparent disinterest. His expression was as hardened as the marble statues adorning the room. That was when the Earl of Waltham, his cousin and eternal provocateur, approached with a mischievous smile and a wineglass in hand. "So, Nicholas, do you still believe you have control over everything?" His tone was light, yet laced with challenge. Nicholas raised an eyebrow, swirling the wine in his glass with the same attention he might give to a fly. "Reality tends to prove me right. Control is an art, cousin, and I am a skilled artist." The Earl chuckled softly, but his eyes sparkled with a dangerous idea. He gestured toward the entrance, where a young woman of worn appearance had just been admitted as part of the serving staff. Her dress was modest, and something in the way she kept her eyes fixed on the ground exuded a resilient dignity, even amidst the humiliation of poverty. "And what about her? If you're so confident, I bet you couldn't turn her into a proper duchess. How about it? 3 months. Marriage. I'll pay $10,000. The provocation hung in the air like distant thunder. Nicholas didn't move a muscle for a few moments, but then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that made his opponents regret their decisions. 3 months, you say? He took one last sip of his wine and set the glass on the railing. Let the game begin. Rose Baxter, the young woman in question, had no idea she had just become part of an audacious plan. All she knew was that after losing everything to her father's gambling debts, working as a maid was her only option. Now, there she was, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres while the rich and beautiful ignored her entirely. "Excuse me?" The voice was firm, almost an order, making Rose look up for the first time that evening. The Duke of Ravenshire stood before her, tall and imposing, as if the entire room revolved around him. She narrowed her eyes, suspicious. Men like him didn't speak to women like her. "I have a proposal for you," he said with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. Rose scoffed, gripping the tray tighter. "If this is about hiring me for something even more degrading, I'm sorry, but my answer is no." Nicholas smirked slightly. There was fire in her, and he respected that, even if it was inconvenient. "Not at all. This is about an arrangement. A marriage, to be exact," she blinked, incredulous. "A marriage? With you? The Duke of Ravenshire?" "Precisely." He spoke as if he were offering tea. "In return, you will have food, clothing, and at the end of 3 months, $5,000, an offer someone in your position should consider seriously." Rose narrowed her eyes, trying to determine if this was some sort of cruel joke. "And why me? There are plenty of other women in this room more suitable for a duke." "Exactly," Nicholas replied, leaning slightly closer, "but none as interesting." When Rose finally agreed that night, it was more out of desperation than anything else. She couldn't turn down a chance to change her fate, no matter how absurd the arrangement sounded. The next morning, Nicholas presented a contract drafted by his personal lawyer. Each clause was written with cold precision, detailing that the marriage would be strictly one of convenience. Rose signed with trembling hands, feeling as if she were signing away her soul. The wedding was a brief and emotionless ceremony. Rose wore a simple dress, hastily altered, while Nicholas looked impeccably elegant, as always. There were no guests, only the lawyer, the provoking Earl, and the crushing silence of an arrangement devoid of true connection. That night, as Rose was brought to the Duke's mansion, the grandeur of the place left her speechless. Yet more than the wealth, it was the emptiness dominating every corner that unsettled her. "This place reflects you," she murmured quietly as Nicholas ascended the staircase, unfazed. He paused halfway up, glancing over his shoulder with a cold stare. "And this is your new world, Mrs. Ravenshire. I suggest you adapt quickly." Rose stared at the vast corridor stretching before her, feeling as small as the last flicker of a candle about to go out. She had accepted the arrangement, but she knew she wouldn't be just a survivor. No matter how opulent his world or how rigid his rules, she would find a way to level the playing field. As unlikely as it seemed, Rose made a promise to herself that she wouldn't remain a pawn. After all, even a pawn, when moved strategically, could become a queen. The rising sun bathed Ravenshire Manor in golden light, highlighting its imposing white columns and meticulously manicured gardens. Rose sat at the edge of the bed in her new bedroom, staring at a pale blue silk dress left there by the housekeeper. It was delicate and magnificent, everything she'd never had and frankly didn't know how to wear. "Madam, breakfast will be served in 15 minutes, announced a maid, peeking through the door with her head slightly bowed. Rose took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what it now meant to be the Duchess of Ravenshire. The title felt strange and uncomfortable, like new shoes that pinched her feet. Very well, I'll be there. As she descended the grand staircase to the dining room, each step brought her closer to the unknown. She knew this marriage wasn't real. It was a game, a sham. But as she looked at the imposing Duke, already seated at the table and calmly leafing through a newspaper as if he hadn't just turned her life upside down, a spark of irritation flared within her. "Good morning," she said, striving to sound indifferent despite the knot in her stomach. Nicholas glanced up, his gaze a mixture of appraisal and curiosity. "Good morning. I trust you slept well." "Like a rock," she lied, sitting across from him. The truth was, she had spent the entire night tossing and turning, trying to figure out how someone so seemingly hollow could simultaneously fascinate and infuriate her. After breakfast, Nicholas led Rose to the music room, where a line of instructors awaited them. "Your transformation begins today," he announced, gesturing casually toward the group. "Transformation?" Rose asked, narrowing her eyes. "Yes, we have 3 months to make you unrecognizable in the eyes of society. You'll learn etiquette, dance, foreign languages, and everything else required to carry yourself as a true duchess." Rose crossed her arms. "So basically, you want to mold me into a doll?" Nicholas tilted his head, a brief and almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "Not a doll. A queen on the chessboard. And if you don't like it, remember, you signed the contract." She pressed her lips together but didn't reply. There was something infuriating about the way he spoke, as though she were just another piece in his perfectly curated collection. The first instructor was a stern woman named Mrs. Bellamy, an expert in etiquette. She began with the basics of posture, correcting Rose's every move with a cold, impersonal tone. Rose tried to follow along, but by the 12th correction on how to position her hands, her patience snapped. "If this is what it takes to be a lady, I'd rather stay as I am," Rose muttered, placing her hands on her hips. Mrs. Bellamy raised an eyebrow, but Nicholas, watching from the corner of the room, chuckled softly. "It's too early to give up, Rose. Think of this as a battle, and from what I've seen, you're good at fighting." "Maybe I'm just tired of battles," she shot back, glaring at him before returning to the lesson. By the end of the day, Rose was physically and emotionally drained. Yet to her surprise, she also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Every small step of progress felt like an act of defiance, not against the instructors, but against the Duke himself. Nicholas, on the other hand, observed her with growing interest. Rose wasn't what he had imagined. She didn't bend easily, and, more importantly, she didn't seem impressed by his wealth or status. She was a woman of spirit, and that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. "You look rather pleased with yourself," he remarked that evening as they dined at opposite ends of a long mahogany table. Rose shrugged, chewing a bite of overly seasoned meat. "I suppose surviving the day was a victory. Maybe you should try being molded by strangers sometime." "I'm already perfect," he replied with a teasing smirk. Rose laughed, shaking her head. "Perfect? You don't even know the meaning of the word." That night, as Rose returned to her room, she felt something within her shift. It wasn't the training or the luxurious surroundings. It was the sense that no matter how impossible the situation seemed, she could find a way to make it work in her favor. Meanwhile, Nicholas sat in his study, staring into the fire crackling in the hearth. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but something about Rose's determination made him question, for the first time in years, whether he was truly in control of everything. The game had begun. and to their mutual surprise, it was far less predictable than either of them had imagined. The second day began with Ravenshire Manor steeped in disciplined silence, broken only by the rhythmic sound of Rose's steps. She was in the grand dance hall, following the instructions of Mr. Redmond, a wiry and stern instructor whose perpetually furrowed brows radiated disapproval. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Miss Baxter, excuse me, Your Grace. Could you please refrain from stepping on your own foot? Rose stopped mid-step and shot him a sharp look. The issue isn't avoiding stepping on my foot, it's avoiding someone else's. And let's be honest, that only becomes a problem if anyone actually wants to dance with me. From the corner of the room, Nicholas observed the scene, arms crossed, a faint smile playing on his lips. He recognized Rose's resistance as an act of self-preservation. It was almost admirable. Almost. Redmond, he interrupted, stepping out of the shadows. If Miss Baxter, pardon, my wife, wishes to learn, she needs motivation. Why don't we demonstrate how it's done? Before Rose could protest, Nicholas extended his hand to her. Reluctantly, she accepted, feeling the firmness of his fingers as they intertwined with hers. Don't worry, he said in a tone laced with mild provocation. You only need to follow my lead. As simple as breathing. I just hope you dance better than you practice humility, she shot back, tilting her chin in defiance. Nicholas pulled her closer, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink around them. His feet moved with a natural grace, guiding Rose across the room with a precision she hadn't expected. At first, her steps were hesitant, but as she yielded to the rhythm, she realized she was, in fact, dancing. See? He murmured, his voice low enough to be an intimate tease. Not so hard when you stop fighting. I don't fight, she replied quickly. I resist. There's a difference. As the lesson continued, Rose felt something she couldn't quite name. It was uncomfortable yet captivating. The way Nicholas looked at her, with that mix of calculation and curiosity, kept her on edge, teetering between frustration and fascination. When the lesson ended, she pulled away, eager to escape his gaze. If you don't mind, I'll get some fresh air. This room is stifling. Nicholas raised an eyebrow but didn't stop her. By all means, the garden can be quite refreshing. Perhaps it'll help you process what you've learned today. Rose sighed, ignoring the condescension in his tone. In the garden, the cool breeze helped her organize her thoughts. She knew Nicholas enjoyed provoking her, but there was more to it than that. He wasn't just an arrogant aristocrat. Beneath all the pomp and control lay a man with secrets, and Rose was determined to uncover them. When she returned to the manor, she found Nicholas in his study, poring over documents. He glanced up briefly when she entered, but said nothing. I have a question, Rose began, crossing her arms. Curious. Normally, it's the other way around. I ask questions and you try to dodge them. Why did you accept this bet? She didn't bother softening her tone. Nicholas leaned back, in his chair, studying her for a moment before answering. I take on challenges, Rose. I always have. It's how I entertain myself. Entertain yourself, she repeated, anger bubbling in her chest. So my life is just a game for your amusement? I'd say it's more complicated than that, he replied, rising to his feet and approaching her. You have something others don't. Oh, really? And what would that be? Stubbornness? Resilience, he said, his tone carrying a seriousness that caught her off guard. That night, as Rose prepared for bed, Nicholas's words echoed in her mind. He was a complicated man, and she couldn't decide whether to fear him, despise him, or something far more dangerous. Across the manor, Nicholas sat at the edge of his own bed, lost in thought. During the dance, he had realized something. Rose wasn't just a wager anymore. She was beginning to challenge everything he thought he knew about himself. The game was changing, and neither of them knew where it would lead. The following week was a whirlwind of lessons, formal dinners, and heated debates between Rose and Nicholas. Every step in her transformation seemed to unearth new tensions between them, and yet, beneath it all, something deeper. Though neither would admit it, their constant provocations were beginning to feel more like a dance than a battle. That morning, Rose walked through the manor gardens, trying to untangle her thoughts. She had escaped her music lessons by feigning a headache and found refuge in the fragrant pathways of the rose garden. It was her favorite spot on the property, a space where the grandeur of Nicholas's world seemed a little less overwhelming. Running. "Away from your duties, Your Grace?" Nicholas's voice called from behind her, laced with the familiar edge of irony. Rose turned on her heel, narrowing her eyes. "And if I am? Will you punish me, Your Grace?" He approached her with the deliberate calm of a predator. "Certainly not. I simply want to understand why such a stubborn woman insists on complicating her own progress." Rose scoffed, crossing her arms. "Perhaps because I'd rather preserve my sanity than learn to play piano just to impress a room full of people who don't care about me." Nicholas stopped in front of her, his gaze serious. "You're right. They don't care. But you should. Every skill you learn, every gesture you master is a weapon in your arsenal. Do you want to survive in this world or not?" Her blood boiled, though not entirely at him. Nicholas was right, and that truth infuriated her. Survival was never my choice, Your Grace. It was my only option. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken words. When Nicholas finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, almost hesitant. "This garden has more history than it seems, you know. My mother used to care for these roses herself." The mention of his mother caught Rose off guard. She knew little about Nicholas's family, and he seemed intent on keeping it that way. He liked flowers? Rose asked, trying to sound casual. Not just liked them. She said they were her way of remembering that even in a cruel world, something beautiful could grow. The vulnerability in his voice stirred something within Rose. For a brief moment, she saw beyond the arrogant and controlling man to someone who also bore scars. "Why are you telling me this?" Rose asked, frowning. Nicholas hesitated, then offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Because I think you understand what it's like to grow up surrounded by cruelty and still find the strength to bloom." She was at a loss for words. As much as she wanted to challenge him, his words disarmed her. Nicholas wasn't the man she thought he was. He was something else. Something she couldn't yet define. As he walked away, returning to the manor, Rose remained in the garden, gazing at the roses that now seemed to hold secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. Later that day, during dinner, their conversation was less combative than usual. Nicholas seemed distant but not cold, while Rose tried to piece together what had changed between them. "May I ask you something?" Rose broke the silence. "That depends," he replied, looking up from his wineglass. "If your mother cared for the roses, why don't you tend to them now? They look neglected." Nicholas exhaled deeply, his gaze momentarily distant. "Because sometimes caring for what's beautiful is painful. I'd rather not get attached." His response struck Rose as an unintentional confession. There was more to Nicholas's story than he let on, and it left her both curious and cautious. That night, as Rose lay in bed, their conversation replayed in her mind. She wanted to understand what made Nicholas so guarded, but part of her feared what she might uncover. In his study, Nicholas sat by the fire, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. He found himself thinking of Rose again, a habit that had become alarmingly frequent. How was it that she could irritate him and intrigue him in equal measure? What had begun as a wager was evolving into something far more complicated. And though Nicholas wouldn't admit it, even to himself, he was dangerously close to breaking his own rules. The next morning, Rose found a note on her bedside table, written in Nicholas's impeccable handwriting. "Sometimes what seems like a wager is actually a lesson. Meet me in the gardens at noon. There's something I need to show you." She frowned, her heart beating faster than she liked. Nicholas was playing a new game, and she wasn't sure the rules were still in her favor. But like a rose refusing to wither, she resolved to face whatever came next. The game was far from over, and they both knew it. At noon, Rose walked through the gardens with steady steps, though her emotions churned inside her. Nicholas's note remained folded in her hand, a constant reminder that something important awaited her. She found him by the arbor, draped in white roses, his expression enigmatic and his posture as impeccable as it was infuriating. "You're right on time, Your Grace," he said with a smile that felt more like a challenge. Rose stopped a few steps away, crossing her arms. "You do love creating unnecessary suspense, don't you?" Nicholas tilted his head as though weighing the accusation. "Suspense has its value, but today the matter is more practical. I want you to see something." He turned and gestured for her to follow. Against her better judgment, Rose obeyed, her curiosity outweighing her resistance. They walked to a small clearing where the manicured gardens gave way to a wilder, but no less beautiful, patch of land. At its center stood a modest greenhouse, aged but sturdy, its glass panels clouded with time. "This belonged to my mother," Nicholas said, his voice unexpectedly soft. "She used to spend hours here tending to her rarest flowers." Rose studied him, intrigued. It was the first time he'd shared something so personal, and she wasn't sure whether to feel empathy or suspicion. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her tone calmer than she intended. Nicholas hesitated, then replied, "Because I want you to understand that sometimes the most valuable things aren't the ones we show the world, but the ones we protect in secret." Rose fell silent, absorbing his words. Nicholas opened the greenhouse door and motioned for her to step inside. The air was warm and humid, filled with the earthy aroma of soil and flowers. Rows of shelves displayed potted plants in various stages of growth. "I stopped coming here after she died," Nicholas admitted, his eyes fixed on a plant just beginning to bloom. "It was easier to pretend it didn't matter." "But it does matter," Rose said, almost without thinking. "It matters because it's yours." Nicholas turned to her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He had expected sarcasm or resistance, not this unexpected kindness. "Why are you telling me this now?" Rose asked, taking a cautious step closer. "Because you remind me of her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The way you fight, the way you resist. No matter what the world throws at you, you don't give up." The confession left him vulnerable, and Rose didn't know what to make of it. Seeing this side of Nicholas was disconcerting, but more unsettling was the way it made something inside her begin to soften. "So that's it?" she asked, trying to lighten the mood. "You brought me here to compare me to your mother and earn my sympathy points?" Nicholas laughed, but it was brief and humorless. "I don't need to earn anything, Rose. This isn't a competition." She studied him, trying to decipher what he really meant. There was something different about him in that moment, something she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. That evening, back at the manor, Rose couldn't stop thinking about the greenhouse. No matter how much she tried to maintain her emotional walls, Nicholas was beginning to breach them. He wasn't just the man who had made a ridiculous bet. There were layers to him she hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, Nicholas sat in his study, replaying the events of the day. Sharing that part of himself had been a risky move, but something about Rose made him want to try. He knew he was treading dangerous waters by opening his heart, but for the first time, he wasn't sure he cared. The wager was turning into something far deeper, and that was both exhilarating and terrifying. In the days that followed, Rose found herself spending more time in the garden, especially in the greenhouse. She discovered a strange sense of comfort there, a peace she hadn't felt in years. Nicholas, for his part, seemed content to observe her from a distance, giving her space to explore the sanctuary on her own terms. But their newfound truce was fragile. That evening, during dinner, Rose decided to push the boundaries. "Why, did you really accept this bet?" she asked, cutting through the silence. Nicholas looked up from his wine, his expression unreadable. "I've already told you. I enjoy challenges." "That's not true," Rose pressed, leaning forward. "You're hiding something, Nicholas. And if you want me to trust you, maybe it's time to be honest." The tension in the room was palpable. For a moment, Nicholas seemed on the verge of opening up. But then he pulled back, rising from his chair. "Good night, Rose," he said, leaving the dining room without another word. Rose sat alone, sensing she was dangerously close to uncovering something important, something Nicholas wasn't ready to reveal. For the first time, she realized that despite everything, she wanted to understand the complicated man behind the mask, even if it meant risking her own heart in the process. Rose woke early that morning, a familiar heaviness pressing on her chest. The air in the manor seemed thicker, weighted with unspoken words and half-confessions. After the tense dinner the previous evening, she decided she needed answers. Nicholas was pulling her into an emotional game she didn't know how to win, and perhaps no longer wanted to play. Dressed in a simple cotton gown, Rose made her way to the greenhouse. It had become her refuge, a place where she could think without Nicholas's constant provocations. But as she entered, she stopped abruptly. On the center table stood a small vase holding a freshly picked rose with a folded note beside it. Life teaches us that some flowers only bloom when they find the right soil. Perhaps you're more like these roses than you realize. Nicholas, Rose scoffed, caught between irritation and an unfamiliar warmth spreading in her chest. Was he being sincere, or was this just another trick to keep her close? She wasn't sure, but the note did something none of the etiquette or dance lessons had managed. It disarmed her. Nicholas, meanwhile, sat in the library, though his thoughts were far from the books around him. Since bringing Rose to the manor, he had been in a constant state of unrest. She was a force of nature, fierce, resilient, and above all, unexpected. The trouble was, he had underestimated the effect she would have on him. When the Earl of Waltham arrived that morning, Nicholas barely concealed his annoyance. "Ah, here you are," he said, rolling his eyes. Waltham entered with his trademark smirk, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "I came to check on my dear cousin and his charming wife. After all, the deadline is almost here, isn't it?" Nicholas snapped the book shut, fixing Waltham with a sharp glare. "What do you want, Waltham?" "I want to know if you're ready to admit you're losing control." "Control is an illusion," Nicholas replied, a rare note of frustration creeping into his voice. Before the conversation could continue, Rose appeared in the doorway. "Ah, the Duchess herself!" Waltham exclaimed, rising and offering an exaggerated bow. "Earl," Rose said coolly, her tone sharp enough to cut. She turned to Nicholas. "Can we talk?" Nicholas nodded, standing and throwing Waltham a warning glance before following Rose out. In the corridor, she stopped abruptly and turned to face him. "How long do you plan to keep me in the dark about what's really going on here?" "What are you talking about?" he asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "You, Waltham. This whole ridiculous bet." Nicholas sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew he couldn't keep it hidden forever. "Fine," he said finally. "Yes, the wager started as a challenge. But things have changed, Rose. Since you came here, everything has changed." Rose crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. "And that's supposed to make me feel better? Knowing you used me as a pawn in your selfish game?" "I didn't expect this to happen," Nicholas said, his voice tinged with something that sounded like regret. "But you've made me see things differently." Rose hesitated, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "And what do you want, Nicholas? Because all you've done so far is play." He took a step closer, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "I want to fix this. I want to prove to you that you're more than a bet. And if you'll let me, I want to show you that I can be the man you deserve." His words hit Rose like a thunderclap. There was sincerity in them, but also a palpable fear that it was too late. "I'm not a prize, Nicholas," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "If you truly want to prove something, start by being honest. Not with me, but with yourself." They stood in silence for a moment, their eyes locked as if both were trying to decipher the other's thoughts. "You're right," he said finally. "But tell me this. Is there any chance you could trust me again?" Rose exhaled, feeling the weight of his question. "Trust isn't something you earn back with words, Nicholas, but maybe your actions can speak for you." With that, she walked away, leaving him alone in the corridor. That night, Nicholas summoned Waltham for a final conversation. He explained that the wager was over, returning the money and refusing to entertain any future provocations. The Earl, visibly stunned, chuckled incredulously. "You're really in love with her," Waltham teased. "Whether I am or not is none of your business," Nicholas said firmly. "But I know I'm not the man who made that bet anymore, and that's enough for me." As Waltham left, muttering something about foolish romance, Nicholas felt an unexpected weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he was playing by his own rules. Not to impress anyone, but because it was what he wanted. Upstairs, Rose sat on the edge of her bed, replaying their conversation in her mind. For all his flaws, the man she was beginning to see beneath the Duke's mask was far more intriguing than the arrogant aristocrat she had loathed. And in his study, Nicholas leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. He didn't know if he could win back Rose's trust, but for the first time, he felt that it was worth trying. The game had lost its meaning. What mattered now was what came after. The next morning, Rose sat by her bedroom window, gazing out at the manor with a new perspective. Something had shifted after their conversation in the hallway. Nicholas was no longer just the arrogant Duke who saw her as a pawn in his game. He had shown weakness, a weakness that felt genuine, even touching. As her thoughts wavered between doubt and hope, a soft knock on the door interrupted her. "Come in," she said, expecting one of the maids. Instead, it was Nicholas, carrying a small package wrapped in plain paper. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice lacking its usual authority. "I thought this might be a good start to repairing things." Rose frowned, suspicious, but took the package. Unwrapping it, she found an old edition of Pride and Prejudice. The book was worn but carefully preserved, its spine slightly cracked, from years of use. "My mother loved this book," Nicholas explained. "She said it showed how pride can destroy people and how love can change them." Rose looked at him, searching for words. She hadn't expected such a personal gesture. "Thank you," she said at last. "I want you to know I'm trying," Nicholas continued. "But I can't erase what I've done. There's something I need to tell you, Rose, something I've never told anyone." They walked down to the garden, where Nicholas led her once again to the greenhouse. This time he seemed more uneasy than confident, as though the words he was about to share were difficult to form. "Have you ever wondered why I accepted this ridiculous wager?" he began, his eyes fixed on a plant before him. "Of course I have," Rose replied, crossing her arms. "And I'm still waiting for an answer that makes sense." Nicholas drew a deep breath. "When my mother died, I was just 14. My father was a cruel man, unyielding. He said emotions were for the weak, that the world was built on transactions and power. I grew up believing that if you controlled everything around you, you'd never be vulnerable." Rose said nothing, absorbing his words. When Waltham proposed the wager, it was instinct. I needed to prove to myself that I still had control. But you... He turned to her, his eyes finally meeting hers. "You're the first person who's made me realize control is an illusion." Rose's heart quickened, though she kept her expression steady. "So that's it? You picked me because I was easy to manipulate?" "No," Nicholas said quickly. "I chose you because I thought you'd be different, but I never expected how much that would change things for me. You're not easy, Rose. You challenged me, and I needed that more than I knew." She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because," he replied, "you deserve the truth, and because I want you to know who I really am. Not the Duke, not the man who made a foolish wager, but someone trying to be better." The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. For the first time, Rose felt she was seeing the real Nicholas. "Do you think pretty words will erase everything?" she asked, though her tone lacked the sharpness of anger. It sounded more tired than anything. "No," he admitted, "but I hope they can be a start." Rose turned her gaze to a white rose nearby, her thoughts racing. "I've never trusted men like you, Nicholas. You come from a world that's only ever given me pain. But I can see you're trying. And that means something." That night, dinner was quieter than usual. There was something different between them, a tacit truce, perhaps even a budding respect. But the calm was shattered when the dining room doors burst open, revealing none other than the Earl of Waltham. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything intimate," he drawled, his malicious smile lingering like a shadow over the room. Roses. Blood boiled. "What are you doing here?" Waltham ignored her, addressing Nicholas instead. "I came to remind you, dear cousin, that your deadline is fast approaching, and I must say, I'm curious to see how this will all end." Nicholas rose from his seat, his eyes sharp as blades. "I've already told you, Waltham, the wager is over. You do well to accept that." "Over for you, perhaps," Waltham sneered. "But wagers have consequences, Nicholas, and you'll still have to face them." As Waltham left, muttering something under his breath, the tension in the room was palpable. Rose turned to Nicholas, her eyes filled with questions. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "No," Nicholas admitted, "but neither will I. Not this time." In that moment, Rose realized that what stood between them was more than a wager. It was a battle against the ghosts of their pasts, and they were both prepared to face whatever came next. The next step? Confronting Waltham and whatever he had planned, together.